Chapter 9 of The Rising of the Tide by Ida Tarbell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. It was this having so much to do that not only saved Dick, but it had saved Sabinsport. For Sabinsport had gone into the war without enthusiasm. She had accepted it fully as a thing she was obliged in honor to carry through. But Dick felt more and more that neither her heart was touched nor her spirit fired. He could not get over the chill that her reception of the news that war had been declared had given him. Not a bell rang, not a whistle blew, not a man stopped. "Well, we're in it," they said as they met him on the street. "It's all right. Nothing else to do. I'm for it." That would be all, and the speaker would walk away with bent head. How, Dick asked himself, a great wave of doubt coming over him, could a town so unmoved, even if so determined, ever carry out the prodigious piece of work which the government asked of it at the time the declaration was made? They were to put everything in. Their sons, their money, their industries were to be conscripted. They were to be asked to change all their ways of living and to do it at once. How could it be that a town seemingly so unstirred could so completely strip itself as Sabinsport was asked to do? Could this determination, which he believed was in her, carry her through the period of sacrifice and effort? Was she to have none of the help of pride, the consciousness of a great cause? How far would Sabinsport go? The first test came when the government announced that we were to have an army of 2,000,000 men, chosen on the principle of universal liability to service. "Never," declared the Reverend Mr. Pepper, "would Sabinsport stand for that." And there were not a few in mills and mines, not a few representatives of various peace parties that gathered about him. They loudly declared in the pro bono publico column of the Argus that we had been plunged into war against our will, that it was still possible to negotiate, that the American people wanted to negotiate, that the President was playing a hypocrite's part, that he was a puppet of Wall Street, whose only interest was to protect foreign loans and to carry on munition making. The Reverend Mr. Pepper, encouraged by the swift gathering of pacifists around him, engaged the Opera House and called for a great mass meeting of protest. Sabinsport should have a right to vote on our going into the war, if it had been denied to the rest of the country. What would Sabinsport do? Dick asked himself the question a little anxiously. Would she foregather at the Opera House? She would not. At 8 o'clock on the evening that the meeting was called, that great forum contained not the whole town and the mines and mills as the Reverend Mr. Pepper had been declaring all day that it would be, but, by actual count, just 200 people, of whom the Reverend Richard Ingraham was one. For ever since the beginning of his life in Sabinsport, he had made it a practice not only to attend but to take part in all discussions, whether held in opera houses or on street corners. But as it turned out, the 200 were not to be allowed to take their vote on peace or war in the orderly, quiet way which Dick himself insisted they should have, for before 9 o'clock a great tramping was heard outside, and into the hall burst all of the active youth of Sabinsport and at least half of its middle-aged. They carried banners on which were written in bold letters, "Right is more precious than peace." "The world must be made safe for democracy." "Germany is a menace to mankind." "Germany wars against peace, we war against Germany." They not only carried their banners, but they brought their orators, who, stationed in the galleries and on the floor, submerged the protests of the Reverend Mr. Pepper and friends and turned the gathering into a rousing declaration that, so far as Sabinsport was concerned, she was in the war to a finish. Each successive task the government set provoked a similar wave of protests. For days currents of unrest would run through the town, but when the moment of decision came, always Sabinsport answered overwhelmingly in favor of the government. There was the draft. As the day of registration approached, the Reverend Mr. Pepper and his friends prophesied riots and, if not riots, at least a very general refusal to register. But every man appeared. They came from the shops and mines and banks and schools, a full quota. It was unbelievable. Why were there such alarms of revolt before, if in the end there was to be complete acceptance? Reuben Cowder had his theory. "I tell you, Dick, the same gang are at work in this town that stirred up the feeling against munition making, that brought that peace council here and so nearly put it over. I expect Pepper and his friends to protest. That's all right. They belong here. That's the way they feel. We can gauge what they say, answer back. I rather think they're good for us. But it's not Pepper that's making the stir now. There's somebody spreading rumors of discontent that do not exist. Who printed those handbills that rained all over town the morning of registration day, denouncing the draft as a form of slavery? Pepper didn't. He was as surprised as the police. Why can't we get our fingers on them?" But clever as he was, he did not get his fingers on them. Waves of discontent, threats of riots and strikes, protests against Liberty loans and food laws continued to agitate the town, filling it with anxiety and irritation. They kept her distrustful of herself, unhappy in her undertaking, but never did they turn her from her resolve to do her full part. Indeed, it seemed to Dick sometimes as if the direct result was to drive those of the town who felt the deepest foreboding, the gravest doubt, to work the harder, thus really increasing the amount accomplished. It was this that explained why, in this admixture of irritation, Sabinsport almost always did more than her part. The rumors and prophecies that she would not respond this time nerved her to fuller efforts. Just how things would have worked out in Sabinsport, just when and how the war would have found its way to her heart, and she would have come to have the supporting uplift of realizing the greatness of the enterprise to which she was pledged, Dick never quite decided. For what did happen was so largely shaped by the news that came to them in the end of June that in the country 25 miles away the government had decided to place one of the 16 great cantonments in which the boys that had been drafted were to be trained into an army. Sabinsport herself had had nothing to do with securing the cantonment. It was the only thing that had happened in that part of the state in the last 2 or 3 decades in which neither Cowder nor Mulligan had had a hand. It was certain shrewd and powerful gentlemen of the city that had persuaded the authorities that this was the most perfect spot in the Union in which to place 50,000 men. Luckily, it was a very good spot, though probably if it had been very bad it would have been selected given the power that was behind its support. The land was rolling, naturally drained. The river which flowed close by gave by filtering a splendid water supply. An important trunk line ran within 5 miles of the camp, making almost ideal transportation conditions possible, and this same trunk line ran through Sabinsport. It was announced that the camp was to be ready in 12 weeks for 40,000 men. The town, accustomed to building on a fairly large scale, gasped in amazement. Some jeered, others protested. It couldn't be done. It would take 12 months, not weeks, to make the place habitable. All through the summer the town watched the growing cantonment to see how things were going. The highway, which ran within a short distance of the selected land, was worn smooth with the cars which went back and forth. The Sunday trains were often crowded with workmen and their wives and sweethearts, and all they saw increased their skepticism. So far as they could make out, it was only a great confusion of lumber, ditches, turned up earth, scattered skeletons of buildings. No evidence of planning. More than one observer came back to say sagely, "They don't know what they're about. It'll never be a place in which men can live. And as to being ready in September, that's nonsense." But ready or not, they found that the cantonment was to be occupied at the time set, and to their anxiety over the incompleteness of the camp there now was added a new concern, a doubt which was hardly voiced but which gave the keenest anxiety. It was the doubt of the recruits that began to appear. How could you ever make soldiers of such material? It was her own first contingent that had awakened this alarm. The town had made an effort to do the proper thing when the boys went off. They were to leave on an afternoon train, and there was a luncheon given them and a little parade through the streets. But the pathetic thing was that these lads, who so often shambled, so many of whom were poorly dressed, all of whom were a little shamefaced at this effort to do them honor, did not look like soldiers. Sabinsport had had so little experience with armies that she could not visualize these country lads, these stooped clerks, these slouching workmen as soldiers. She went back home not a little unhappy. How were we ever going to make an army from such stuff in time to do anything? That was becoming her engrossing thought. How are we ever going to do anything in time? Her pride was touched, and there was a real but unspoken fear in Sabinsport's heart lest we were not going to come up to the mark before the world. There were just two people in Sabinsport, that is, two who talked and were listened to, that were not worried about the camp or the making of an army. Captain Billy and Nancy Cowder. To Uncle Billy, all these boys were the boys of '61, and every trainload sidetracked on the numerous switches that the main line had provided on the edge of Sabinsport in preparation for the handling of men and materials for the camp. Every trainload filled him with more and more confidence. "You'll see," he said. "We were like that. Just you wait." As for Nancy, she was amazing to Dick. She was one of those rare beings of unquenchable faith. With it went an almost universal sympathy. Dick had expected to find her as obsessed with the cause of Serbia as Patsy had always been with that of Belgium, as deaf to other calls, as impatient with Sabinsport's diffused interest as Patsy was. But he discovered at once that her heart was open to every cry, and that her hand instinctively reached out to aid any human being that needed help. She had not been at home a fortnight before she was busy planning with Ralph and Dick and her father for better housing for the girls in the factory around the point, with Jack Mulligan for better schools at the mines. When war came she was as sensitive as Dick to what the town was going through. She realized, even better than he, how utterly Sabinsport was cut off from all outward manifestation of war. How she saw and heard none of its martial sights and noise. She was obliged to recreate without the help of outward things. It made the girl extraordinarily sympathetic. Indeed, in all Sabinsport at this period of uncertainty and alarms, there was no one who kept so confident and serene an attitude or who treated with more humor and common sense the rumors and fears that ran the streets or saw with more practical eye the things to be done. It was Nancy who first realized what a camp 25 miles from Sabinsport might mean to the town, the opportunity and the threat that were in it. Nancy, it will be remembered, had been in London when the war broke out. She had seen Kitchener's army grow. She had lived with soldiers, too, in hospitals and in camps, and she quickly realized that Sabinsport had a part to play. It was to Dick that she swiftly went for consultation. "They will be 25 miles away," said Dick. "Oh, yes," said Nancy. "But what is 25 miles with our factories full of girls and the town wide open? With all their homesickness and their need of friends and life, we must get ready for them." "But how?" said Dick. "What shall we do?" "Well," said Nancy, practically, "we women must have our canteen ready for their passing through." But all that Nancy could say at the start had no effect upon Sabinsport. Nothing in her experience could give her an inkling of what it would mean to have a camp of 50,000 men 25 miles away. The distance was prohibitive. What would they have to do with Sabinsport, with the city within 5 miles? It was the city's business to take care of the camp, not hers. It was November before Sabinsport began to feel any responsibility about the camp. By that time the boys had discovered the town. Naturally it was the city so near them that had drawn them first, and that continued to draw them in the largest numbers. And it was the city which from the start had accepted the responsibility of guarding the boys who came to her. The city had formed great committees of men and women. She had passed ordinances. She had opened canteens. Hundreds of her homes were open to the boys, her clubs and churches and halls, regularly on the Wednesdays and Saturdays when they were off. The city did wonderfully well from the start, and the commanding officer had applauded the cooperation that she gave him. In all this activity Sabinsport, 25 miles away, had not been asked to help. It was natural enough. The city always had ignored Sabinsport. To be sure, she was a nice little country town and had a quaint hotel, with a wonderful cook, the best place in the country round to motor out for supper. Sabinsport had always resented this attitude. She was the older. She had never quite gotten over feeling that she should have been the city. She who was there so many years before, and who was responsible for the discovery and first development of this wealth which now the city handled and from which she so wonderfully profited. That is, Sabinsport was jealous of the city, her patronage, the fact that she was never taken in. It was partly this that made her unresponsive to all the pressure that Dick and Nancy brought upon her in the early days of the camp. To organize, to look after the soldiery that they felt inevitably would seek the town. Always the same answer came back. Let the city look after them. She's not asked us to help. It's her business. But little by little she discovered that although she might make no overtures to the camp had found her out and was making good use of all she had to offer in the way of pleasure and freedom. The boys had discovered two things in Sabinsport, the two that Nancy had predicted, that she had factories full of attractive girls and that her saloons were wide open. The better sort had discovered the paradise and high town. The consequence of Sabinsport's blindness and her refusal to accept responsibility heaped up every day. The girl question, as they called it. There were sudden marriages which shocked and distressed her. There were no marriages which horrified her even more. A new type of woman began to appear in the streets, and again on Saturday afternoons soldiers were taken back to camp, but not to barracks, to the guardhouse. Irritation and disgust with the camp grew in the town, and then, late in November, sickness began. It ran rampant through the camp, still insufficiently equipped with hospitals and doctors and nurses to handle anything like an epidemic. Heartbreaking tales of deaths from lack of care, it was charged, filled the town. Nancy, who from the opening of the camp had given practically all of her time to whatever service she could put her hands to, and who by her common sense, her skill, her sweetness, had won completely officers, doctors and nurses, now gave herself up to regular nursing, coming back only once a week for a half day's rest, on Monday afternoon always, though nobody at the time thought about that. Dick practically spent his days and nights in service. He too had from the start been received by officers and doctors as one of those rare civilians who can be allowed the freedom of a camp and really help, not hinder, its work. But Sabinsport was not rallying to the efforts of Nancy and Dick. The town was horrified at the things she saw going on. She bitterly blamed the commanding officer, the War Department, the government. She resented the intimations that she had had from both the authorities in the city and in the camp that her failure to deal resolutely with her saloons and with the strange women who were finding shelter within her limits was a menace to the boys. Matters were not at all helped by the kind of agitation which had begun in the town with the hope of controlling the situation. The center of this agitation was Mrs. Susan Katcham, president of an old time temperance organization, a good, aggressive, tactless woman, whose main effect upon Sabinsport had always been to steel even the sober to the support of the saloon. Mrs. Katcham now had no need to argue about the disastrous effects of the open saloon. Every day was demonstrating it to the disgust and shame of the town. There was just one man everybody knew that could put a stop to this thing, and that was Jake Mulligan, for Jake controlled the police, and Jake owned half or two-thirds of the property in Sabinsport on which liquor was sold. Mrs. Katcham went for him openly and viciously, hammer and tongs, and all she did was to make him take a terrible oath that he would not budge an inch in the matter, that it was the business of the camp to keep its soldiers at home and not his to run Sunday schools for the protection of grown men. The tragic thing to Dick was that he saw, growing in Sabinsport out of this clash, an increasing distaste for a soldier. Never, never, he said, would the heart of Sabinsport be reached until this was blotted out. But what was to be done? He took it to the commanding officer himself, and between them they laid out a plan for capturing Sabinsport's heart. "It's melodramatic," said Dick. "It'll do the work," said the general. But that was to be done. The execution of the plan, which the general and Dick had agreed upon for the siege and capture of Sabinsport's heart, was not easy in the pressure and anxiety which the epidemic in the camp had brought, and its probable effect seemed to both men more and more doubtful as the friction between the town and camp grew. It was on Christmas night that it was to be carried out, the Sunday night before Dick came home, white with weariness and despondency. He had had a day too hard for him. That he knew. One which his physician would have called dangerous. But how could it be helped? At daybreak a doctor at the camp had telephoned that Peter Tompkins couldn't live, that he had asked for the minister. Would he go down? "Be there in an hour," Dick had answered, and he was. The poor lad was almost gone. Dick sat with him to the end, took his last message, winced, wondered, and bowed his head at the sheer, cheerful bravery with which the boy took what he called faintly his medicine. "Didn't take care like they told me," he said. "Tell Mother they've done the best they could." But Dick knew that while the loyal fellow might take upon himself the cause of his own death, blundering orders and unthinking friends were responsible. The boys had been told to bring as little as possible to camp, only a suitcase which could be sent back with the clothes they wore. Peter, like hundreds of others in that cruel month of December, had started from his home in his oldest, thinnest clothes, without an overcoat. He was going to throw everything away, he said, and not trouble to send anything back. And there had been nobody in the town with sufficient forethought and authority to prevent the risk he took. He had reached camp chilled to the bone. The supply of clothing was short. He had to go about for days in his thin old garments. He could not get warm, exercise as he would, hug the fire as he would. In the tremendous pressure of preparation and organization, it was impossible that the physical condition of each boy should be known to his officers. Peter had to shift for himself in those first days. He was shy and homesick. It was Dick who was making a specialty of the homesick, who had discovered how serious his condition was and who had seen to it that he was sent to the hospital. And it was Dick who had given him the care which the one doctor and one nurse in the ward where there were 200 very sick boys could not possibly give. It was too late. Peter was dead, and 2 hours before, Dick had seen his rough pine coffin on the platform, ready for the journey home. A clumsy wreath had been laid upon it by some sorrowing buddy. At its foot stood a cheap suitcase. containing all the boys' few belongings. At the head a soldier kept guard. Dick's heart ached for the mother who must receive the pitiful box, and he groaned as he thought of the many, very many, he feared, that would follow it. Sabinsport's temper at the moment weighed even more heavily upon Dick that night than the sickness at the camp. The inevitable scandal that both he and the general had feared had come the night before. 20 boys, off for their Saturday holiday, had slipped into Sabinsport for what they called a blowout. They had gone to Beefsteak John's, one of the cheap workmen's hotels, had taken rooms, laid off their uniforms, put on pajamas, and called up the barkeeper. Of course he could give them what they wanted, for they were not in uniform, and he had done it. The scandal had been made worse by the introduction of a half dozen of the strange women who had taken up their dwelling in Sabinsport. Before morning the crowd was on the streets, rioting madly. The boys had been arrested and were in jail. The whole story was in the city's Sunday morning paper. Sabinsport was disgraced before the world. The general and Dick had talked the matter over in the hour after he had closed poor Peter's eyes, and both had agreed that this probably put an end to their Christmas celebration. "You can see," the general said, "how impossible it would be for me to do my part unless I know that every saloon in Sabinsport is absolutely closed. That's my ultimatum. They tell me there's a man by the name of Mulligan that controls the town. Could you get at him?" "I could," said Dick, "but I don't know whether it would do any good. Mulligan is obstinate. I'm sure I could have persuaded him long ago to close every house he owns in Sabinsport and willingly have stood his losses if it had not been for Mrs. Katcham. So long as she continues in the field he will keep everything open to spite her." "I don't wonder," said the general sympathetically. "Same here. She's been trying to force me to appoint a mother for every 50 boys. Let 'em live in the camp. Thinks I'm in league with the liquor interests because I refuse. Told me so to my face. You can't do anything with such women. But you must stop the liquor selling there, some way, unless you want me to appeal to Washington." Dick had come back to town anxious and disheartened. It's a nice situation and Christmas only 2 days away. He was sitting perplexed and weary before his fire. And who should come in but Mulligan himself. "Can you give me a few minutes, Reverend?" he called in his hearty voice. Dick stared in amazement. "Of course," he said. "Come in." He helped him with his coat, stirred the fire, offered him a cigar, and sat down. "See here, Dick," Mulligan began. "I wouldn't come telling anybody in this town I'm ashamed of myself, but you. I am. That thing last night was my fault. If I'd ever given the boys around town a hint that they weren't to sell booze to soldiers, they'd never have done it, uniform or no uniform. But I never batted an eye at them. I've known all along they got stuff whenever they wanted it. I never tipped the police not to see things, but I never tipped them to see things, and that's what they're waiting for. If it hadn't been for that Katcham woman, I'd have done it. I'm that mean I couldn't stand it to see her get her way. Now she's getting up a mass meeting for Christmas. Think of that, a mass meeting on Christmas. Well, I'm going to beat her to it. I control 10 saloons in this town, all except the Pikers. I'm closing every blamed one of them today. Cancel the leases. I'll turn out every doggone man that don't shut down. And I'm warning the little fellows that they've got to follow suit. They're howling, but let them. I've told them I'd treat them square, pay them for 6 months. They know me. Let them sue if they want to. They know that I can prove that they've been selling to the boys. There's not a jury in the state that would give them damages. The bar at Beefsteak Jim's is closed now. I'm going to make this town clean, so clean that the boys can play dominoes without being laughed at. And I've seen the chief. I've told him if his men so much as wink at a glass of beer sold to a soldier, I'll fire him. I've told him he's to run out any shady woman that shows her bleached head in this burg, and put the camp on to any boy that tries to sneak into any mischief. I'm going to make this town clean, Dick. So clean all these doggone camp towns around the country that are rolling up their eyes at Sabinsport wickedness and calling attention to how good they are and rejoicing that we've got it in the neck will sing another song. I'll show 'em. And what tickles me most is getting ahead of that Katcham woman. She's not going to spoil our Christmas by her mass meeting. When the town gets up tomorrow morning, they'll find that things are shut down. I've seen to it that it gets out. Everybody will know without waiting for the Argus, and you ought to see what's going in the Argus tomorrow night. I'm letting it be known that the landlords in this town made a voluntary agreement. Note that, Reverend. Voluntary agreement, for the good of the army and the good of Sabinsport, not to sell another glass of beer as long as this war lasts. Don't that sound noble? Won't that shut up those neighborhoods in the state that are taking pains to say how depraved this burg is? I don't want you to tell anybody I had a hand in this, Reverend. Just telling you because I care about what you think and because I want you to know the straight goods. It's going to be done, and so you can stop worrying. That's gotten me more than once, see you looking so anxious. And then there's Jack. I hate to have him know over there in France what happened Saturday night. I'm sending him the paper and along with it a copy of the agreement. That's all. I'm not going to have his town disgraced again. So long, Reverend, and get some sleep. You need it. There were tears in Dick's eyes as he wrung Mulligan's hand. You better believe I'll sleep, he said. Now we'll have our festival, and I'm counting on your being there. The general and his staff are coming, and we'll have a surprise which couldn't have been sprung if it hadn't been for what you've done. You've saved Sabinsport more than once, Mulligan, but you never did it so good a turn as today. Nothing in that, Reverend. Thank the Katcham woman. I had to beat her to it. Dick went back to his pipe. He was too happy to sleep. He remembered a remark of Katie's made months ago, and he repeated it aloud. The Lord sure is a wonder. For several years now, Sabinsport had had a Christmas tree on the square at 5:00 p.m. on Christmas Eve, with carols and prayers, and the free distribution to all the children of large and enticing stockings filled with candies. At 6, almost every house in town had lighted candles in its windows. This year they were to have their Christmas tree as usual, but in deference to Mr. Hoover, the candies and candles were to be saved. At 9:00 on Christmas night there was to be a community celebration, the details of which nobody seemed to know, but the program had been hinted at in every quarter of the town in such a mysterious way that the anticipation was high. Dick and Nancy had been responsible for drawing everybody in. The mines and mills, as well as Hightown, had representatives. Every quarter knew that somebody from its ranks was to do something, though what that something was an entire secret. Sabinsport had a wonderful place for a great community celebration, the Opera House. When Mulligan and Cowder planned the Opera House, they had been in their most optimistic mood. They wanted it big enough for conventions and expositions. A stage on which you could have a circus was Jake's idea. The result was a great gaudy barn with a stage which would have done for a hippodrome. Financially, the size of the thing had defeated its purpose, but for a great town celebration it was magnificent. It was none too big for the affair in which Dick was interested. By 7:00 on Christmas night the Opera House was packed. At 7:30 the program began, songs and tableaux and speeches and impersonations. It went without a hitch, swift, compelling, and oh so merry. In an hour after it began the house was a happy, cheering crowd, helped not a little by their joyfulness by the presence of scores upon scores of soldiers, guests from the camp, and by the aid which the applause was getting from two boxes filled with officers, the general among them. The program was almost finished, all but a single number which appeared simply as "music and tableaux." If the audience had not been so interested, it would have noticed that up to this point there had been but the scantiest of reference to army or navy, to war or country. The very absence of these topics hushed them to silence when suddenly the orchestra broke into "Over There." It was like a call, penetrating, stirring. It hushed and thrilled them beyond applause. The hush deepened when suddenly across the long drop curtain there flashed the words, "Somewhere in France." The orchestra played on, every brain fitting the words to the notes. "Over there, over there. Send the word over there that the Yanks are coming. The Yanks are coming. The drums rum tumming everywhere. So prepare. Say a prayer. Send the word to beware. We'll be over. We're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over, over there." Slowly the curtain rose on a scene that much looking in the last few months at photographs and picture papers had made familiar to them. A French town, the kind they knew the boys were billeted in, with its long row of gray faced houses, its red tiled roofs, its quaint church with its simple, very simple statue of Joan of Arc, and behind, rising perpetually, mountains along which ran a highway, climbing up and up. A company of boys in khaki swarmed over the place. They were resting on their arms, waiting orders. They hung out of the windows, sat in the doorways, grouped carelessly in the roadways, swarmed over the pedestal up to the very feet of the figure of Joan. The house watched the scene with swelling heart. Then from an upper window there suddenly came a clear baritone. A boy, leaning out, his eyes on the little statue, began to sing a song new to Sabinsport. Alone he sang through the first verse, then the wonderful refrain was taken up. "Joan of Arc, Joan of Arc, do your eyes from the skies see the foe? Don't you see the drooping fleur de lis? Can't you hear the tears of Normandy? Joan of Arc, Joan of Arc, let your spirit guide us through. Come, lead your France to victory. Joan of Arc, they're calling you, calling you." It was but the beginning. It had put the waiting boys in the mood for song, and the appealing refrain had scarcely died away when the tension was broken by a merry voice starting, "Where do we go from here, boys? Where do we go from here?" From gay they swung to grave, and then back to gay. The Star-Spangled Banner brought everybody to their feet. "I don't want to get well, I don't want to get well," set everybody to laughing. Then came "Christmas Night," and then "Home, Sweet Home." It was almost too much for the singers themselves, for more than one lad on the stage dropped his head, unable to go on. As the song rose, so sweet and familiar, so laden with memories, the audience sat with quivering faces and eyes grown wet. If it had not been for the emotion which had seized it, it would have been sooner conscious that there was an unusual accompaniment to the words, a rhythmical beating which grew louder and louder until it became a steady tramp. It had grown so near that it would have broken the spell which held the house if suddenly a bugle had not sent every man on the stage to his feet. They fell in line, and just as the outside tramp came too distinct to be mistaken, an order, "Forward, march," came quick and sharp. They filed out, and behind them came others, an indeterminable stream, across the stage, only to reappear, mounting upward along the road in the background. And as they started upward, at the right and top of the height, a great luminous American flag was suddenly flung out. It waved and waved as if in salute to the mounting men. They went up up. Their young faces, turned to their banner, wore looks of such resolve, such exaltation, that the hearts of the men and women watching, breathless below, swelled with pride and hope. The host came on, wave after wave. The orchestra played on the wrought up audience as on a viol. They broke into cheers, dropped into silence, sobbed, then cheered and cheered and cheered, and when the light gradually faded, the curtain slowly dropped, the music little by little subsided. They sat unstrung, listening to the tramping grow dimmer and dimmer until it was lost in the sounds of the town. It was a new Sabinsport that went home that night. Whatever might happen, never again would she doubt, or close her heart to the soldier. She was his. The general, waiting in his box for Dick, said as he grasped his hand, "That's settled, Ingraham. We'll have no more trouble with this town." But if Sabinsport had been chastened and her heart opened, she still had to grope her way into the organized service that alone could restore her hurt pride and give her some realizing sense of being a part of the great undertaking. And it was a hard moment for that. In all the war there was not a month more difficult than January of 1918. The camp and the town were in the clutch of the most cruel weather that part of the world had ever seen. Again and again in these weeks the miles of switches and sidings in the valley were blocked with long trains of cars filled with coal, with every conceivable kind of freight for the camp, as well as with materials needed for the shipyards and overseas. Although every effort was made to keep tracks clear for troop trains, every now and then one filled with tired and shivering men would be held up. They sang, oh yes, they always sang, but you could not go among them and not know that the singing often hid frightened and homesick hearts. The town itself, surrounded as she was by mines underlaid with coal, was suffering. Sabinsport was startled to find some of her own families in actual danger of death by freezing. In a town which all its life had been accustomed to wait until the last minute and then call up and ask that a load of coal be delivered at once, and to get it as it would get its roast from the butchers, it was natural that many prosperous families were low in fuel supplies. It was hard for a man of influence then not to throw aside all sense of responsibility for anybody but his family. Queer stories of the tricks that men played in order to get coal headed for their neighbors were told. And as for the poor, they waited in long lines with pails and scuttles to get their little lot, and many a time went home without it. Unreasonably enough, storm and snow classed themselves in Sabinsport's mind as part of the war, and her uneasiness grew. Was it all to be like this? Failure, sorrow, shame, suffering? Was she never to see anything orderly, sufficient, successful? Was there nothing in war that was brave, glorious, and stirring? Sabinsport was seeing only the fringe of the great undertaking, and it looked ragged enough in the early part of 1918. And all this Dick was going from depth to depth of discouragement. Inveterate believer that he was in this town, which he had come so to love, in the country in whose institutions he so believed, doubt and despair of the outcome of the great undertaking grew upon him. We are not going to be able to handle even the physical side of it. It was not alone what he saw at home, it was what he heard from his friends in Washington. Their letters, once hopeful, became despairing. "It looks to me today," one of them wrote him along in the middle of January, "as if the whole war machine has broken down. I believed and believed, but the fact is we're not getting men over. It's all nonsense about our having 400,000 on the other side. They're not over 100,000. It's all nonsense about our building ships. The whole business is simply tangled up. It's an awful, humiliating failure, I'm afraid, Dick. The men at the top are camouflaging the whole situation. I cannot endure it that we men back here should fail the fine fellows who gave themselves so utterly, so fearlessly." This letter was the last straw to Dick's despair. He was overwhelmed with the futility of all the gigantic effort, sickened by the inability of Sabinsport properly to even take care of its own in a stress of weather, sickened by what he saw in the camp. Sabinsport was failing, the camp was failing, the country was failing. And why should he expect anything else? What was the human race after all but a set of selfish, limited bunglers? And so night after night he tossed and groaned and slept fitfully. Things grinned at him. He wakened feverish and worn. In the day things said, "What's the use? Why talk about democracy? Why talk about ideals?" And he, why he was an utter failure. To get into it, to have a turn in the trenches, to be soaked with filth, to be broken with fatigue, to struggle to his feet, to feel a blessed death wound, that was the only thing that would count. He worked, of course, worn every day his mask of courage and good cheer, but day by day it was growing harder to keep it on. Day by day his strength was failing, for Dick, for the first time in his life, was recklessly disobeying the boundaries which had been set for his physical existence. The overfatigue which he had always conscientiously avoided, he not only sought but coveted. The strains which he had been told might at any time be fatal to him, he took almost gladly. Finally his friends among the physicians at the camp warned him. "You'll break down, Ingraham, as sure as the world, if you don't take things easier." His friends grew worried. Nancy came to him and begged him to stop, to go away for a while, but he laughed at them all. In the bitterness of his soul he had come to feel that here was his way out. He could give himself here. The break came suddenly in the hospital at the camp. One day he collapsed utterly and was taken home unconscious. An almost superhuman effort of doctors and nurses brought him around, and a month later, very white and humble, he was taken from Sabinsport to the south by Reuben Cowder himself. His desire to die had left him. He was his normal self, save for his physical weakness. He meant to get well and come back to Sabinsport. Sabinsport, whose grief and anxiety over his illness had touched him to the heart. And he did his part. 3 months later he came back, a little thinner, a little quieter, but quite himself again and capable of steady effort. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of The Rising of the Tide by Ida Tarbell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Dick's impression as he made his first rounds of Sabinsport after his return was, "Why, here's a new town." What had come over her? He had never pictured any such realization of the war as he sensed at every turn. It seemed to him that it was the one occupation, the one interest of everybody. And it was an orderly, systematized interest. The town seemed not only to have mobilized, but to have trained herself. She was doing her work with a vim and a freshness that he had not thought possible. The women, for instance, the women who had held off, said the city is taking care of the camp, who as a whole had never gone beyond the knitting stage, had been marshaled into organized groups and were working with the steadiness of so many factory hands. Since his departure a Red Cross house had gone up, and there from 8 to 5 every day regular detachments served under a direction which he found was almost military in its severity. And it was a democratic house. Thursday afternoon was the afternoon out of cooks and maids in Sabinsport, and many a one gave her 3 or 4 hours at the tables on an equal footing with the greatest ladies of Hightown. Nancy's canteen, which had met so poor a response when suggested, could be counted on now, night or day. It was no unusual thing for 2,000 tired boys to be served at 4 a.m. with coffee and food at the headquarters by the track. It was amazing the women that could be called on for this severe duty. There was a little manicurist at the Paradise, a saucy, competent, flirtatious person that went into the canteen organization for night work. 3 nights a week, from 9 at night until 6 in the morning, she was ready for call, and again she would serve her full time, and after 2 hours' sleep go back to her table, a little pale perhaps, but never any less skillful, any less flirtatious. And there were the greatest ladies of Hightown that enlisted like the little manicurist for night work and did it as faithfully. Dick found that not only the women were working, but that the war spirit among them was hot, even fierce. He dropped in one afternoon to the Woman's Club to hear the story that an Eastern journalist, lately returned from a trip along the front, had to tell. As he watched the audience, a large proportion of whom were knitting, for Sabinsport's Woman's Club had come to the point where it was stipulated, when bringing on a lecturer, that he should not object to knitting. He recalled the discussion he had had a couple of years before with Ralph. Ralph had insisted loudly that it was nonsense to talk in America about war, that the women would not stand for it. They would riot first. Dick had answered, "Ralph, that's something you read in a book. If you knew women and knew history, you would know that when the test comes, they not only will stand for war, but they will be violent supporters of war." Ralph had accused him of being out of touch with the modern world, of not knowing anything of the new woman. This conversation ran through his mind now as the speaker told the story of the first gas attack by the Germans, of the deadly effect it had had on the unprepared English, and then remarked that the English now had a more deadly gas invention than anything that had come out of Germany. He was almost startled by the applause which rang through the room. Practically every woman took part in it, the knitters dropping their work to clap. The speaker went on with stories of how our troops made their first attack. 19 dead Germans, he said, to 6 dead Americans. Again the room rang with long clapping and cries of "Good boys! Good boys!" Not a tear, not a bowed head, but pride, fierce pride and vengeance. I was right, thought Dick. Ralph read it in a book, not out of life. Again and again Dick noted profound changes in individuals in the 3 months in which he had been gone. None of them moved him so deeply or gave him so much joy as that in Mary Sabins, who was now regularly installed as a nurse's aide in the hospital at camp. Her face wore the look of one who had struggled to a high mountain and from the top was looking into a new and glorious world. Mary had been a very unhappy woman in the months since young Tom had left her for France. It was not only the shock of his going, but it was the still greater shock that her husband had refused to use his authority at her request and forbid the boys going away. For the first time in their married life of some 25 years, a strain had come between them. Tom Sabins could not understand why Mary did not feel his pride in the boy's courageous and adventurous spirit. She should not understand why he did not resent the invasion of their snug and comfortable world. When the war came, she was still further bewildered by the change that came over Tom. Every business and social occupation that had engrossed him, the pleasures to which he had been so devoted, he threw them aside as completely as the boy had thrown over college and home. It was Tom Sabins that had been asked to head the draft board of the community, and Mary had never seen him so engrossed or so interested in anything. Why should he give his days to men of whom she had never heard? Why should he be so eager, so enthusiastic, so indefatigable in this work? Mary watched him with resentful eyes. Dick had talked frequently with Nancy about their friend, and the two had tried their best to interest her in some form of camp work, but she had refused peremptorily to be enlisted. And here she was now, going regularly day by day, to the hospitals. "Tell me about Mary Sabins," he asked Nancy, the first Monday afternoon after his return that he was able to go to the farm. "You know, of course," Nancy said, "that just after you left, young Tom was invalided home. He went into the Foreign Legion when our forces took over the ambulance service and got a nasty wound in the cheek and shoulder almost at once. It was nothing dangerous, however, but it was very hard for Tom to make Mary believe this, and she raved at her inability to go to him. He got on famously and soon was allowed to come back. You never saw anyone so exultant as Mary was when Tom first came. It seemed to her, I think, that her old world, at least part of it, was restored. But it was pitiful to see how soon she discovered that young Tom's notions of life were utterly changed, that the interests which had absorbed them in the old days had no meaning now, that his one thought was of the war, and his one hope was to return to it. I saw her get 2 or 3 staggering blows, utterly unconscious, of course, on the boy's part. One night I was there and he was talking about American girls, the nurses and canteen workers. "Why," he said, "I didn't know women could be so wonderful. You haven't any idea of it until you see them working over there. They're not afraid of anything. You cannot tire them out. Maybe they will drop, but they won't give in. Afraid? Why, the Germans bombed the front line hospital I was in just after I got mine, and those girls never turned a hair, never looked up, never hustled, just went about laughing and cheering us up. They killed 2 of them, the murderers, and there wasn't a woman there that did not stick. It's great. It's great to know that women can be like that." You should have seen Mary's face. It was tragic, and Tom was so unconscious. Then her second blow came when she knew that he was going back. You see, she hadn't an idea of what this would mean, that was the end of it. I think she had some notion that he would not want to go back, that getting hurt would kill this strange, unfamiliar thing that possessed him. Mary is like so many of us American women. Certainly I used to be so, afraid somebody will get hurt, afraid of suffering. Why, I cannot see that you can know much about life unless you suffer and see suffering. Mary could not understand it. When young Tom really was all right, which was very soon, he went out and enlisted in the Marines. Mary went all to pieces. Of course Tom stood by the boy. A week after he was gone, she came out here one afternoon. "Nancy Cowder," she said, "do you think I could be used at the camp?" "Oh, Mary," I told her, "if you only would go to the camp. We need you so." She looked at me in such a curious way. "Need me? What for?" "The boys need you," I said. "We cannot do for them the 100th part of what we ought. Boys like young Tom need you. You should be doing here, Mary," I said, "just what other American women will be doing for young Tom." "I think I must try," she said. "I've discovered I've lost my husband and I've lost my son. I don't understand what they're talking about. I don't understand what they feel. They have no interest in me and no interest in what I do. I don't know that I can ever get them back, but I must have something to do." Well, I sent her into the city for a course as a nurse's orderly. She made a great discovery there. And oh, the things she has learned since she has been working in camp. You can see from her face that it's a new Mary. And Tom is the happiest man in the world, though Mary, I think, doesn't know it yet. The clouds have not all cleared off her mountaintop, but she is there. War is a dreadful thing, a hideous, wicked thing, but there are some of us that have discovered the greatness of life through it. A new attitude toward the conduct of the war had come in Sabinsport, too, Dick remarked. When he had left, the town had been alive with disheartening rumors of failure, graft, inefficiency. The meetings of the War Board were given over to them. Captain Billy, than whom nobody in all of Sabinsport was more desirous that the country should make a record for itself in the war, was doing his utmost to prevent that end by decrying loudly everything that was attempted. Mr. John Cummins was having the time of his life. Never had he been able to reduce so many people for so long a time to despairing doubt of all human institutions as at present. He could scoff and not be contradicted at the absurdity of an untrained democratic body raising a great army. He could sneer without answer at the notion of the United States, soiled as its hands were with stealing from the red man, from lynching the negro, from gobbling up innocent Panama, setting out on a crusade to make the world safe for democracy. Mr. John Cummins was certainly having a wonderful time when Dick went away. But all this had changed. To his amazement, he found that criticism of the government, any doubt of a war enterprise, any reluctance to accept at full face value any request of the government, was met in Sabinsport with a fierce declaration that it was all German propaganda. "What has happened?" he asked Reuben Cowder. "What turned the town in this direction? When I went away, the easiest thing in the world was to get a hearing for a criticism, sympathy for a sneer. What's done it?" "Well," said Cowder, "Sabinsport discovered that it was being worked. You know, I've always suspected that it was true. You remember how we talked back in 1915 at the time of Labor's National Peace Council, how I told you that no such organization could thrive in Sabinsport when there was plenty of work without outside feeding. And you know how for a year or so after that went to pieces, pro-German talk was not very popular. After we went into the war, it revived. The town was alive with distrust. And I was sure, just as I was about Labor's peace party, that there was somebody feeding it. You take the negroes, why, they almost came to the point of revolt here against the war. Nancy had a cook out at the farm that came home from one Sunday afternoon meeting to tell her that she weren't going to save food any more, that all the United States wanted it for was to make slaves of the negroes again, and that if Germany came over here, she would keep them free. There was a regular campaign here against the Liberty Loan and thrift stamps. And when the women took their registration for service, the idea was spread around among all the more ignorant people that the women were being registered in order to be taken to France to cook and work for the soldiers. Now, things like that don't start out of the air, and I set out to find out where it came from. I got a clever fellow here that I've had before when trouble was brewing in the wire mill to sort of sound out things, you know. Well, he had not been here long before he came to me and said, "Mr. Cowder, Uncle Sam has told me to get off this job. Wanted me to tell you that you need not worry, that they were looking after it. They must have been confounded smart, these Secret Service people, for I've never yet been able to find out who they were, except one, nor what they did. But this is what happened. Along the 1st of March, a fine-looking chap came into my office one day and asked to see me alone. As I shut the door, he showed me his badge, Secret Service. 'Mr. Cowder,' he said, 'I want to notify you that about a half dozen men in your munitions plant, one of whom you've trusted greatly, Mr. Max Dahlberg, will disappear from this town day after tomorrow, or if not, the next day. I would like to tell you the facts, but I'm under orders to divulge nothing, even to you. I think you and your plant will be safer if you know nothing of it. We would like to have you make no comments, but carry on your work as if nothing had happened. That's what the government asks of you.' Well, Ingraham, you know how I felt about Max. I would have trusted him as soon as any man in this town, much further than I would Otto Littman. As a matter of fact, it had been Otto that I suspected all the time, as you know. But Otto is here. Moreover, the same young man that warned me about Max came back a week later and said to me that he thought that it would be an act of justice and humanity to support Otto Littman in the town, not to let suspicion drive him away. I cannot make head or tail of it, Ingraham. Only this I know, that Max did disappear, along with half a dozen of the best workmen we had, that Otto is still here. Moreover, the rumors, the criticisms that fill the air have stopped. That fellow told me they would. He told me that it was out of my own factory that these things had been coming. The town somehow got wind that something had been going on, that the suspicion and criticisms which ran through the streets were spread by German agents. And today a criticism which is perfectly well founded has no chance at all. You cannot even joke about the conduct of the war without running the danger of arrest. Why, the funniest thing happened here the other day to John Commons. You know Katie Flaherty, of course, takes care of you, doesn't she? Well, Katie overheard John Commons criticizing a report that the government was going to forbid the use of starch in collars, make us all wear soft collars. Commons said, "I suppose they want the starch to stiffen up the backbone of the soldiers." Katie was so incensed that she promptly went to the chief of police and reported Commons. He was waited on, and it took some real explanation and expostulation on his part to keep out of jail. It tickled the town to death, and John has not been nearly so voluble since. Yes, there's a great change come over our spirit, and I would give a good deal to know just what was done. What became of Max, what he had planned, how they got him, was known to only one person in Sabinsport. Offhand you would have said that it was the last person to keep a secret, for it was Katie Flaherty. Since Mikey's death, the real occupation of Katie Flaherty's life had been hate of the race that she now considered her personal enemy. Dick had sometimes chided her for this bitterness. "God forgive us all, Mr. Dick," she would say. "I've been saying we ought to love everybody. Take the Jews now. See how they've gone into the war, how loyal they are to the United States. I tell the boys they ought not to lay it up against them any longer that they're Jews. But a German, Mr. Dick, that's different. He won't salute the flag. And look at the things they do, sinking the ships like they did. Think of all our grand, lovely young men drowned in the sea. The dirty Germans, sticking a ship in the ribs in the night. I can't stand it to think of 'em dead. I'm that foolish about the boys. I can't see one in the streets I don't cry, 'Old fool I am.' I won't never go to another parade, Mr. Dick. You'd have been that ashamed of me if you'd seen me at camp when they came marching up the field, the thousands of 'em, the grandest boys you ever seen. I couldn't see for crying, and it wasn't still crying I did it out loud. But nobody laughed. Only a strange man patted me on the back, and a woman went white and said, 'Stop it,' fierce like, 'Stop it.' So I came home. I'll never go to another parade. And to think the Germans have the heart to kill 'em, boys like ours. I'm for driving 'em out of the country. They're all spies. There's the butcher over on the south side, Johann he calls himself. Think of that Johann in the United States, a regular old German, talking about the Vaterland. Can't say it in English." "Come now," Dick said to her once. "Johann has been in this country for 40 years." "What's that, Mr. Dick? They're all the same. You can't make Americans out of them." She developed a suspicion of strangers that was almost a mania, and was forever watching for evidence of intrigue. One morning she came in to serve Dick's coffee with a big envelope in her hand. She was handling it gingerly, as if it were something that might explode. With great solemnity she opened it. "Look here, Mr. Dick. It's a spy I found, I'm sure of it." Out of her envelope she pulled a big red valentine and dramatically turned the back to him. On it was written in bold black letters the words, "Don't buy a Liberty bond. The Kaiser says so." "Why, Katie," Dick said, "that's no spy's work. That's a joke." But it took much explanation for Katie to see it. Don't buy a bond, that to her was treason. The Kaiser says so, more treason. Finally she gave in to Dick's persuasion, and she went off saying, "It's a fool I am." But Dick always had a feeling that he had not quite convinced her. Katie's watchfulness and her self-imposed task of bringing every suspicious person to justice was known to everybody in Sabinsport. It had long been known particularly well to the strange young man who had appeared in Reuben Cowder's office early in March and warned him of approaching changes in the force of his munitions factory. Other things concerning Katie were known to this same young man, and one of them was that she had a room to rent on her first floor. The floor opening onto the upper level, ever since Mikey went away, had been rented by Mr. Max Dahlberg. Downstairs, opening onto the lower level by a little side door, was an extra room which Katie had said recently for the first time to herself she would rent if she had a chance. She had not put out a shingle, but she had told her neighbors, so it was not surprising that one morning when she was busy in the rectory that there should have been a knock at the door, a call for Mrs. Flaherty, an inquiry about a room to rent, and a bargain promptly made. Katie took to the applicant, a jolly, clean, keen-eyed American boy, older than Mikey, but with something about him that suggested Mikey. Himself a grand fighter, too, Katie had said to herself. Her new tenant was John Barker by name. "I'm only at home through the daytime, Mrs. Flaherty," he said. "I'm in the mines, an engineer, running night shifts. I won't be in before 8 or half past in the morning, for I get my breakfast over there. I want a quiet place to sleep through the day, and I will be off by 5 in the afternoon. If you want any references, I can give them, and here's a week's rent in advance." And Katie, to whom paper references meant little, and the look in a man's eye everything, had said, "It's all right, Mr. Barker. I will have the room ready tonight, and you can come in the morning. You will find the key with Mary O'Sullivan next door." And Katie that night when she went home made the little room clean and tidy, put the key to the outside door with Mary O'Sullivan, describing her new tenant with enthusiasm. He proved a good tenant, none better. He came as regularly as the morning and went out as regularly. His presence in the house was quite unknown to the gentleman who occupied the top floor, and who had long congratulated himself on his luck in having a lodging over which he had some absolute control. As a matter of fact, there was only one entrance to his upper floor, save that on the street. A rude little staircase ran up from the kitchen into a tiny square hall, and a door opened into the room which had been Mikey's. It was by this door that every afternoon when Katie came home from Dick's, she went upstairs to make the rooms. Max's habits were very regular, exemplary person that he was. He was at the munitions works at 7 and never left until 5. His doors were carefully locked behind him. He had no need to concern himself about anything in Katie Flaherty's house. But in this secure dwelling strange things were going on in those hours when Max was at his laboratory and Katie at the rectory. Every morning, promptly at 8:30, a quiet, tired-looking young engineer unlocked the side door of Katie Flaherty's house and drew his curtains. But once the curtains were drawn, an extraordinary transformation took place. The fatigued face became relaxed. The heavy, dirty boots were replaced by the softest of slippers. 2 very dangerous-looking weapons were slipped into his belt, and in the pockets of his soft sack coat something that looked like a pair of handcuffs. And then, with keys in hand, he quietly slipped up the back stairs, opened this door, and began an investigation of the belongings of Mr. Max Dahlberg, Reuben Cowder's wonder of the laboratory. And the things that he found! You could tell that by the glint of victory in his eye, by the moments when he would straighten himself and address the air in a whisper, "Could you beat it?" When he noiselessly tapped his thigh and said, "It's the completest thing I ever heard of." The young man was making out a pretty case in Max's secure chamber, little by little, from the papers and photographs which he examined with such scrupulous care day by day, always leaving them exactly as he found them, taking infinite pains not to leave behind him any trace which might make Max suspicious that his privacy had been invaded. And he gathered the proofs of as fine a piece of destructiveness as any planned within the borders of the United States by the band of plotters that Germany had sent out. What young Barker found was simply this, a carefully laid scheme, every detail worked out with German efficiency, to blow up simultaneously every munition plant in that great district around Sabinsport, where now literally millions of dollars' worth of shells and shrapnel and wires and guns were being made for the Allies. Max had been very ambitious. He had not been simply content with doing away with his own plant. He had placed in every one of the neighboring towns agents that he could depend upon. By months of the most careful plotting and arrangement he had coached them in their part. Oh, it was to be a dramatic piece of frightfulness. The very day was fixed, 2 weeks from the time that young Mr. Barker finished photographing the last piece. At 10 o'clock at night there was to be one grand explosion, running along the river for miles, back into the hills north and south, a piece of destruction that would not only rip every wheel apart but shake the valley, tumble down its buildings, set fire upon fire, drive men and women from their homes, murder, destroy. It was the monstrous German imagination for destruction at its highest, a great conception. Again and again young Mr. Barker had to stop in wondering admiration at the perfection of the scheme. "God!" he said, "and to think we've got him." But now the time had come when he had to have help, the help of Katie Flaherty. He knew he could count on her. He realized nothing would ever quiet the pain in Katie's heart but to get her German, to give blow for blow. And so one day, after records and photographs were complete, after they had been spread before certain high authorities in a nearby city, Katie had another call from her roomer. It was the first time she had seen him in weeks. "And what is it, Mr. Barker? Is something going wrong? Did I forget your towels?" she had greeted him. "Not at all, Mrs. Flaherty," he said cheerfully. "You never forget anything. You're the best landlady I've ever had. But there's something on my mind, and I want your help. May I have a talk with you?" And seated in the kitchen of the rectory, he laid before her the outline of what he had discovered. He showed her the big silver badge that he wore beneath his coat, and told her what he wanted. Briefly, it was her cooperation in arresting Max. She had listened, amazed, unbelieving, and then, as the truth dawned upon her, horrified. And when her help was asked, her whole bitter hatred blazed up in a passion of desire. Here was her chance. She'd get her German. But how were they going to do it? "Do you ever go up to his door of an evening?" he asked her. "Every night at 9 o'clock. I rap and give him his pitcher of fresh water, and sometimes, when I have it, a bit of fruit. He's always been such a quiet, gentle soul, playing his piano and singing his songs. I can't believe it's true." "It's true, Mrs. Flaherty," said young Mr. Barker. "And what is it you want?" "Simply this. I will not leave as usual tomorrow afternoon. I will be in my room. At 9 o'clock there will be a knock at your door, and you will let in 2 men with a hearty 'How do you do? I'm glad to see you.' Then I will ask you, Mrs. Flaherty, to go ahead of us up to the door, knock and give Mr. Max his pitcher of water, and then, Mrs. Flaherty, we will take care of him. Can you put it through?" She looked him in the eye, and young Mr. Barker had not the shadow of a doubt but that he could count on her. It is doubtful if Mrs. Flaherty could have ever told you what she did in the 33 or 34 hours between the time that Mr. Barker closed the door of the rectory kitchen and the hour when she admitted 2 stalwart strangers with an Irish laugh and greeting that, if the windows above had been open, could certainly have been heard. The windows were not open. If they had been, Katie might have heard an angry altercation going on. When she and the 3 men, 15 minutes later, slipped up the stairs as noiselessly as so many cats, they heard it. And Katie knew the voice that was raised to meet the lower, cruel tones of Max. It was Otto Littman's. How well she knew it. For 30 years Katie had given her services at every dinner that the older Mrs. Littman gave. She had helped at every birthday party. She had known Otto from the time he was put in his mother's arms, and her heart almost stood still. The hand that held the tray almost trembled as she realized that this was Otto, the son of her good friends, the only Germans in all Sabinsport she had never suspected, who was talking. She did not know what he said, but young Mr. Barker knew. He knew from what he heard that Otto had gotten some inkling of the horror devised, that he was protesting, threatening, declaring that whatever it cost him, even if it were his life, he would reveal the horrible thing. Either Max must call it off or he, Otto, would stop it. And the even, calm tones of Max had said, "Too late, Otto. It's you that will be silenced, not at that moment." Young Barker gave a nod to Katie, who, knocking loudly, called out in the most natural and cheerful of tones, so natural and cheerful that he said to himself, "Isn't she a wonder? Here's your water, Mr. Dahlberg, and an apple." And Max Dahlberg, intent only on keeping up an appearance, opened his door. And as she stretched out her tray, there appeared in his face over her shoulders the muzzles of two vicious looking guns. At the same instant the door was thrown open, and two powerful individuals had him by the arms, and cuffs on his hands and cuffs on his feet. It had all been done so quickly and so quietly that neither Max nor Otto had uttered a sound, nor did anyone for a moment. Katie slipped downstairs. Young Mr. Barker, in his level voice, said, "Mr. Littman, I've heard your conversation. So have these gentlemen. We all understand German. It lets you out. You may go." Otto, looking him in the eyes, said, "I'm willing to take my punishment. You will find me at home when you want me. I have some letters which may help you. They're all at your disposal." The exit of Max Dahlberg from Sabinsport was very quiet. An automobile drove up to his door on the upper level, as it often did in the evening, and three gentlemen came out of the house. If there had been anybody to watch, they would have noticed that the one in the middle was being supported. They might have thought him ill. He was helped into the car, and thus departed from Sabinsport, the wonder of the laboratory, of the munition plant. And thus ended his magnificent dream of frightfulness, for at the same hour that he was being quietly conveyed in a comfortable car out of Sabinsport, various other gentlemen in various other towns belonging to this grandiloquent scheme were undergoing the same experience. Katie slipped back to her kitchen, and her face was wonderful to see. It was the face of the righteous warrior with his enemy's head in his hands. It was the look that all the Celtic Clarities and O'Flahertys from the time of the Anglo-Saxon invasion, through the days of the Caesars, through all of the centuries of England's injustice to Ireland, had worn. It was the greatest moment of Katie Flaherty's life. There was only one fly in her ointment. She could not talk about it. She could not tell Mary O'Sullivan or Mr. Dick. The hardest thing that could ever come to her was the seal upon her lips. It was not that Katie wanted to talk about her part in the thing. That had nothing to do with it. But it was to tell of the battle, to tell of the defeated enemy. It was to tell of the revenge. It was a wonderful story, and all her Irish imagination cried out to depict it to her neighbors. But she had given her promise to young Mr. Barker, and clever man that he was, he had put a flea in her bonnet which he knew would ensure absolute closed lips. "You will not, Mrs. Flaherty, give one hint of what has happened. Your roomer upstairs is not the only German connected with this business. The capture of others depends upon absolute secrecy about what has happened to Mr. Dahlberg." So Katie, in this cruel trial of silence, was sustained by the hope that she might get another German scalp. This was the reason that when Dick came home no hint of what had happened was given to him, though there were mornings when Katie Flaherty would gladly have given her good right arm to have been able to have opened her lips and pictured the whole magnificent scene. Now, it is not to be supposed that interested and heartened as the Reverend Richard Ingraham really was in all these changes that had come over Sabinsport, that they either satisfied his heart or filled his mind. Night and day one thought absorbed him. Stronger than all others, one feeling mounted higher and higher. He thought he had put behind, in the weeks of rest in the South, his love for Nancy Cowder. He thought he had had it out with himself. He believed he had made his renunciation, that he could come back, work with her in camp and town, go out as usual to the farm on Monday afternoons, meet her easily and naturally everywhere, even see outwardly unmoved the day come which he believed thoroughly would come, when she would marry Otto Littman. And though it is improbable that he could have gone through the ordeal with anything like the control and certainty that he had persuaded himself was possible, yet such is my confidence in the man that I believe he would have put it through if, when he returned, he had not divined, rather than learned, that there had been a great change in the relations of Otto and Nancy. It was not a change, so far as he could judge, from which he had the right to draw hope. He told himself again and again that, on the contrary, the change probably only meant that later, when the war was over perhaps, when suspicion of Otto had passed and Nancy was released from her labors in the camp, that again they would seek each other. Yet the fact that at this moment they were not seeking each other, that so far as he could make out they were not seeing each other, gave Dick an unreasoning encouragement. In spite of himself, his dreams came back. In spite of himself, he saw more and more of Nancy Cowder. What had happened with Otto he could not make out. Otto still remained in town. It was certain that Reuben Cowder, as well as other leading men who once had shunned him, were taking pains to support him. It was evident that a great burden had been raised from Rupert Littman's heart. Never had he been so affectionate, so proud of Otto as now. That is, at the very head of Sabinsport's business, where suspicion of Otto had first begun, there had been a great change. These men, if you asked them, would tell you that they knew it to be a fact, from the very highest authority, that Otto Littman had rendered the Secret Service of the United States a tremendous service. They knew it to be a fact that he had run the danger of losing his own life in order to save the lives of others. That was as far as they would go. As a matter of fact, that was as far as they could go. But the authority on which these facts were stated was so unimpeachable that there was not a man of them that doubted. And there was not a man of them that was not doing his best for Otto. But this had not won him Nancy Cowder, Dick found. A change had come over the girl. She was much quieter. But that might be because of her continuous work at the camp, work which she never left, which, whatever the effort and the strain called for, she always gave. Reuben Cowder was anxious about his daughter, with good reason, and one of his first requests of Dick on his return was to try to bring her to her senses. And yet Dick, in his foolish heart, argued that it was not the work at all, that her pallor came from pain over a break with Otto. And though many a night he had wild fancies that this was not so, he always told himself in the morning that he was wrong, that it was only a matter of time when the breach between them would be healed, that it was his business to keep away from her. And so, through weeks of labor, Nancy and Dick steadily went their ways, each unconscious of what was in the heart of the other, each valiantly resolved that they would make no sign that would hurt the other, and yet daily each growing closer to the other. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of The Rising of the Tide by Ida Tarbell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. It is only when one loves a town as Richard Ingraham loved Sabinsport that one is conscious of the currents of unrest, of groping, of joy and of grief that fluctuate through it as truly as they fluctuate through the soul of man or woman. Love makes one sensitive, sensitive to fleeting shadows that others never see, to secret hopes and faiths that others never know. Dick had not been long home before he began to understand that Sabinsport, hammering at her war task like a Vulcan, hating her enemy as robustly and openly as any primitive deity, still was restless in heart, dissatisfied with the war, untouched by its loftiest aims and hopes. Something more in experience must come to Sabinsport, thought Dick, and he sometimes wondered if it would have to be a baptism of blood. She would stick to the end, he felt. Indeed, he did not believe that all the nations of the earth combined could pry Sabinsport now from the task to which she had put her hand. But he wanted more from her in carrying out this task, a fuller sense of the bigness of the thing in which she was engaged. Where was it all to come from? As the spring drive of the Germans pounded back farther and farther the English and French lines, the anxiety in Sabinsport grew, intensified. Out of it Dick saw coming one emotion that greatly rejoiced him. Sabinsport, through all the war, had never any very strong feeling for England. To Belgium and France she had given her heart. A little of it had gone to Serbia. England never had won more than a slightly grudging recognition. But now, when that amazing army stood with its back to the sea, and the world realized that though every man might fall, no man would surrender, something broke in Sabinsport. For the first time she realized something of the fullness and the nobility of the English sacrifice, how with characteristic English quiet the nation had put everything in and called it a bit. To Dick, whose love of English hearts and English ways and whose faith in the unconquerable English soul was second only to his love and faith in America, this belated understanding of England by Sabinsport gave both joy and hope. She was beginning to see things. They were getting down into her soul. As the days went on and the Germans drew nearer and nearer to Paris, as the city was actually shelled, and as rumors came of preparations for a siege, with all the doubts they brought of its being possible for her to long withstand it, something like panic seized Sabinsport, an almost angry panic. Where were the Americans? For what had she been making all her great effort? Why but to stay the invading hordes? Were we too late? Were these hundred thousands of men that we boasted now of having landed in so short a time, to come in only in time to see the destruction of France and the certain invasion and destruction of England, which Sabinsport believed that would mean? Doubt and anger and horror possessed her. And then suddenly the American army did appear. There was Cantigny, and then in the very nick of time, the last moment when the wearied and overwhelmed French were actually in retreat, our boys came, Sabinsport's boys, and careless of the long journeys which had brought them to the spot, the sleepless hours, they broke over the foe, beat him down, beat him back, followed, defied, laughed at his boasted formations, his impregnable trenches, his deadly nests of guns. It was true, as the most experienced and hardened French cried, "Rien c'est le reste." Nothing stops them. Nothing stops them. When the story of Château Chevert came back to Sabinsport, men shook one another's hands, clapped one another on the back, told over and over every item they could gather. Captain Billy walked up and down the street, not ashamed of tears, crying, "I knew they would do it, just like the boys of '61." They treasured every story of reckless exploit, of daredeviltry. "That's our boys, just like them." And they were even prouder of the fact that, reckless and unafraid as they showed themselves, they had known how to take discipline, to play the game according to rules that the wisest of English and French generals were saying, "They're good soldiers." Château Thierry and the weeks of struggle that drove back the Hun from the lovely Marne country, back through Saison, back to the Anzin, those were great days for Sabinsport, and particularly they were great days for the War Board. The War Board, said Dick to himself, has settled down to enjoy the war. It spent its nightly sessions in recounting tales of heroism. Every list of citations for bravery was gone over item by item under the leadership of Captain Billy. At first they set out to remember the names, those wonderful names, not only American, but Russian, Greek, Romanian, Pole, Italian, Serb, Chinese, and yes, German, even German. "By the jumping Jehoshaphat," Captain Billy would say, "we've got 'em all, every blamed nation on earth, and every one Americans. They've all got it, good American grit. It don't make any difference where their names come from. There isn't one of them but dies with his face to the Hun." Over and over they recounted the gallant stories of men going out from shelters into which they had been ordered to carry in wounded, and sometimes receiving their own death bullet as they laid their man in a place of safety, of their quick strategy in surrounding machine gun nests and their fearless hand-to-hand fights with the crews. And then those tales of the way they ran in their prisoners. Captain Billy was never tired relating the historic tale of the sergeant from the New York East Side who came back with 159 prisoners and complained to his superior officer that one had died on him. And nothing so delighted Captain Billy as the tales that came over of the doughboys' directness and common sense in an emergency. "Just like 'em. Don't faze 'em a bit. Just as much at home over there as here. I guess they're teaching them downtrodden European countries the kind of men a free country makes. Read about the doughboy and his mules? Harness broke. Mules ran away, turned them into a tree, smashed one, jumped out, looked at him, saw he was done up, shot him, rigged up and went ahead. Never said a word, never asked anybody anything, just did what was necessary. They say those French police haven't stopped talking about it yet. They would have held an inquest, sent in a report, and probably stopped the work of that train for a week. That's the difference." Dick was deeply touched to notice how every now and then in the rejoicings somebody in the War Board would nod up at Lieutenant Mikey, looking down on them from the wall, and say, "What a pity he couldn't have been in it now, couldn't have fought with his own men. But he was our first one. We must never forget that." Nor did they forget their other heroes. Often and often they would nod up to Albert on the wall and say, "Hold on, old fellow, your time's coming," or to Joffre, "Feeling pretty good tonight, ain't you, Papa Joffre?" Oh, the War Board was certainly enjoying the war, now that it was going their way. While the War Board regaled itself with stories of doughboy exploits at Cantigny and Château Chiby, the saving of Rheims, the capture of Saint-Saëns, while it speculated over the big gun, where it was, how it operated, quarreled over the merits of arms, and exhausted itself in devising methods of destroying Germany. The town outside, the busy working town, seemed sometimes to Dick almost to be living in France with the boys. Quite wonderfully and naturally they had built up from what came to them in letters and news the life of their boys over there. Of course they were proud of their exploits, but they did not want to dwell too much on them. They meant ghastly wounds or death. What they wanted to know was just how the boys lived and where, the kinds of beds they slept on, the kind of food they ate, whether it was really true that when they felt ill they had the care that they ought to have. And all of this eagerness to know where the boys were and how they were getting on in detail, made every letter that came almost a matter of town importance. It was quite amazing how the contents of these letters circulated. The very arrival of one was known, sometimes in advance of its delivery, for the post office force took notice when a letter from anybody in the AEF arrived. And I have known it more than once to happen that if a letter came in Saturday night there was no Sunday delivery one of the postal clerks would run immediately to the telephone and call up, "Hello, Mrs. B. Here's a letter for you from Tom if you want to come down and get it. None of us can get away much before midnight." You can imagine how quickly Mrs. B. went or sent. The great interest and excitement of the postman's life in those days was delivering the letters from the AEF. It was the practice of these functionaries in Sabinsport to put the mail in the box outside, if you had one, to throw it on the steps if you had not, or sometimes, if it rained, to try your door and throw it in the hall. But whenever there was a letter from a soldier, none of these things were sufficient. Your bell rang with an eager, insistent cry which said, "There's a letter from Tom." And the next morning the probabilities are that the postman lingered a bit to see if you didn't come out and tell him personally something of what was in the letter. And you did it. Oh, how you loved to tell what was in the letter, and how it went up and down the town, and everybody telephoned and compared it with what was in Frank's letter or Will's letter. After the letters, Sabinsport's great interest was the Stars and Stripes. There was no paper published on the globe so popular in the town. A half dozen of the boys had been inspired to send it home by the clever appeal of the paper itself. "Do the home folks a good turn by having us send them the Stars and Stripes every week," the editor said at the head of his page, in an appealing display type. "There are not many things you can do from this side of the water," he said, "for your folks or your old pal or that girl back home. The Stars and Stripes would come to them like another letter every week or another little present." The doughboys had not passed it up, as he advised, and the paper came to be to the home folks all that he had prophesied: intimate, natural, humorous, eloquent, the best bit of editing the war had inspired. The Stars and Stripes brought to Sabinsport such a sense of how the boys were thinking and feeling and acting. The whole town was comforted and helped. One supreme consolation it brought, the certainty that whatever the war might be doing to their boys, it was not changing their tastes. The Stars and Stripes proved that. It was just like them. Although it was known that many of their men were with the divisions fighting along the Marne, and although every night when the Argus came, the first thing that the town turned to was the casualty list, they went a long time untouched. So long that Sabinsport came to have a curious kind of jealousy. The city, 25 miles away, had lost heavily. She rejoiced, and yet she somehow wanted to pay her price. But when it came, poor little Sabinsport, it came like a stroke of lightning. One evening Dick was called up by Ralph's successor in the Argus office. "Parson," he said in a broken voice, "I wish you would come down. It's dreadful. The casualty list has just come in. There are 12 of our men dead, Parson. 12 of Sabinsport's boys. Ralph's name is among them. How are we going to get it to the people? There's no notice to any family yet, as I know, and I cannot call them up. Won't you come down and help me?" It was not long before Dick was bending over the list, and the two men were asking themselves who would better go here, who there, who's the friend of this family, who the friend of that. They called up the priest for the 3 of his own boys, the Reverend Mr. Pepper, who, in spite of his pacifism, still had kept a gentle heart for one of his flock. They called up Jake Mulligan, and between them the sad duty was performed. The news flew. All Sabinsport wept that night. The next morning there was laid at every door in town, subscribers or not, a little extra sheet of the Argus, Sabinsport's honor roll. And first in the list was the name of Lieutenant Michael Sullivan, killed at Belleville Wood, July 15, 1916. It fell to Dick to go to Patsy. It was nearly midnight when he called up Father McCullon and told him. "Wait until morning," the old man said, "and come yourself, Dick. Mother and I could never do it." Patsy had been back in Sabinsport since the beginning of the year. After her marriage she lived in Ralph's camp until he had sailed in January. By a fortune which seemed to both of them miraculous, he had been promoted until he was a lieutenant in the Rainbow Division. He had sailed, believing that he would soon be in the trenches. To Patsy, as to him, this had been a matter of glad rejoicing. She had come back so proudly to Sabinsport that Mary Sabins had been shocked. "To think anybody," she had said to Patsy, "could rejoice when her husband was in danger of his life. I cannot understand it, Patsy, and you in your condition, too." For Patsy was scarcely less proud or less open about the fact that Ralph was in France in the trenches than that she soon would be a mother. The mother of a little Ralph, she proudly announced, for she seemed to have no doubt in the world that she would bear a son. Ralph wanted a son. The boy had come in the spring. Never in her capable, vivid life had Patsy been so proud or so joyous. And Ralph was dead. And Dick was on his way to the farmhouse to tell her. It was early when he came up the walk, and Patsy, radiant and beautiful, oh, far more beautiful than she had ever been, met him at the door, for she had seen him coming. She needed no telling. With that divination of womankind whose loved ones are at the front, Patsy sensed that Dick brought her sorrowful news of Ralph. She did not even lose her color, but taking him by the hand, led him into the cheerful sitting room, where before the fire little Ralph was cooing in his crib. She took the baby up and, standing straight and proud, said, "Tell me, Dick." "Ralph's name is on the casualty list, Patsy, among the dead. But do not lose hope," he said. "It may be a mistake." "It's not a mistake, Dick. He knew it. I knew it. We fought it out together. I promised to live to raise our son. Take him, Dick. Take him." And she held out the child, crumping to the floor as Dick sprang to her side. Stricken as she was, so stricken that in the coming days life itself seemed to ooze from her veins, and she lay for hours in long white swoons, the spirit of her remained undaunted. She had made her sacrifice when she said good-bye to her husband. As Ralph had had to fight like every man of passionate heart and living imagination to conquer his natural fear of death in battle, so Patsy had fought to conquer her fear of his loss. Both had won, for when the test came, both were victorious. Ralph, so they learned one day, had lost his life in the full tide of battle. His company had been ordered to secure a foothold on the high northern bank of a river to which the army had fought its way. They had been led with extraordinary skill and courage, but in crossing one after another of the officers had been killed until Ralph was left alone in command. He took his men through the last cruel shelling of the desired objective, but in the final push he was fatally wounded. Even then he had refused to give up, and for hours continued to direct his men as they literally clawed their way into the side of the bluff. "He would not die," wrote home one grieving young soldier, "until he knew we were safe." And Patsy made her fight as bravely. She held her head high. Had she not little Ralph, who, so they had both agreed, was one day to carry on his father's work for justice and peace among men? If there were times when it seemed as if her brave heart must break with pain, no one ever saw her shed a tear or say other than, "I would not have held him back, no, not even to have him here today." It was to the honor and sanctification of Sabinsport that the bereaved took their sorrow as they did. It was more. Out of their loss there seemed to come to the town a mysterious illumination, the enlarged sense of what it was all about, which Dick had so desired for her. which he had felt so keenly she should have, to sustain her. Wounded and hurt as she was, the town had to find a reason, a great reason, to justify it all. Defending laws on sea or land that had grown out of past struggles between nations was not enough. Vengeance was not enough, not even avenging wrongs as great as Belgium and the Lusitania. Sabinsport needed to feel that out of this sacrifice there should come some new conception of life, some greater guarantee of more joy and freedom to more people, some pledge that in future times there was hope of less sorrow, less hunger, less pain everywhere on the earth. This she finally saw was what it was all about. And in groping toward this realization, there came to Sabinsport something that was akin to a new faith, and with this she was for the first time fully and unalterably reconciled to the Great War. It was no longer grim determination, no longer hatred of an enemy that she despised, that held her to the undertaking. It was a large and luminous faith that out of it all a long step had been taken toward realizing that new world to which since the beginning of time men have lifted their eyes. It was amazing how the town softened under the touch of its sorrow, how many old feuds sank out of sight, how much warmer grew everybody's heart. "It's doing something to us, Dick," Reuben Cowder said to him one day. "Why, I even heard Captain Billy speak approvingly of Wilson today." It did something to Dick. It made easier his renunciation of Nancy, which he still believed was his duty. That was his part, his sacrifice, he told himself. He must give himself now to keeping alive, feeding this new sense that had come to the town. And he threw himself with enthusiasm into the work of explaining to Sabinsport the national aspirations and hopes that began to take form in the unfamiliar countries of Europe. At the camp, at the boys' club, in his church, and at the War Board, Dick made himself the advocate of Serbian and Bohemian, Czech Slav and Pole. For the first time in all Sabinsport's life she began really to sense that these strange men who filled her mines and her factories carried in their hearts loves of their lands like hers for America, that they too had dreams, some of them coming down from hundreds of years of struggle, of freedom and equal opportunity in their own nations, and her chivalry, her sense of protection, her determination to help them see it through, grew in her knowledge. It was perhaps quite natural that as the days went on Dick should come to feel that Sabinsport had had a change of heart so profound that it had softened even her bitterness against Germany itself. It was this feeling that he might even talk mercifully to Sabinsport now that led him into what afterwards was known as the Parsons' Big Break. It was not until October that Dick was able to bring himself to believe that at last the Allies had the upper hand. From the start he had seen the war as long, long, long. It was that made him suffer so. Cantigny, Chateau Thierry, the falling back to the Vesle, none of these things had really convinced him. But when the Americans captured St. Mihiel, following on the break in the north, he suddenly realized the splendid scheme on which the great French general was working. "She's beaten," he said. "She's beaten. It will take time, but we've got her." No longer was it, as the French had said in that unquenchable faith of theirs, "On l'aura." It was no "on l'a." And as the days went on and he became more and more certain, his imagination flew ahead to the time when the Allies would reach the borders of enemy territory. He had his theory about this. Germany would unconditionally surrender before she would allow the Allies to fight on her territory. But he could not give up the idea that the Allies should enter Berlin, not as destroyers, but as world peacemakers. He meditated much on this, and at last one October Sunday morning preached a sermon on the text. "He that is slow to anger is better than the mighty." and he that ruleth his spirit than he that taketh a city." At the head of his notes he had put a title, "The Great Revenge." As he talked, his imagination kindled, and almost before he knew it he fell into a rhapsody. "In thinking of that great day, the day when victory is near and certain," he said, "I've dreamed a dream, and in this dream I've seen the Allied statesmen and their military leaders gathered for a final conference which they believed will be the last before the end of this greatest of human tragedies. With the terms for the world's settlement outlined and accepted, with a full knowledge of the military situation before them, with a sober certainty that victory is in their hands, though it may be delayed, the conference is ready to disband. And it is then that an American general, whom first the Allied military forces and later the Allied diplomats had come to listen to with respect, if not eagerness, not only for the knowledge and fine judgment that he brought to their councils, but because of a quality of spiritual insight which many of them believed to amount to genius, it was then that this American general asked a hearing. "As you know," he said, "I'm in the fullest agreement with every conclusion of this conference. I believe that the military situation in the Allied armies has been rightly presented, that nothing has been concealed of either weakness or strength, that the conclusion that the enemy must soon yield is inevitable from the facts that have been laid before us. What I ask the privilege of saying to this conference will add nothing to what you already know. It will add nothing to the plan of world reorganization which has been suggested. It is not a matter on which action is required. It may be called a dream or a vision, if you please. I only beg that you will listen and not deride, for what I have to say comes from an inner conviction so deep that to withhold it would be for me little better than treason to the great end of all this suffering, this labor of spirit and of mind through which we have gone in these many hard years. The enemy will soon yield. I'm one of those that believe that he will yield at or before his last line of defense. I believe this, not because I think that line less strong than it has been represented, less strong than the enemy himself has boasted it to be. It may be the most nearly impregnable line of defense that has been constructed in all the history of the world. I believe he will yield because I believe that yielding at this point is the inevitable result of his own lifelong military teachings. Germany has held that those people she wished to subdue could be frightened into submission. Her people have been schooled for years to believe that by inventing new and unheard of ways of destruction, by attacking the defenseless, by stealthily striking where the laws of war had forbidden men to strike, they could so terrorize the world that it would submit to her supremacy without long resistance. She has learned that neither the French nor the English, the Italian nor the American people can be terrorized. She has learned that free people have no fear of human devices, however hideous and destructive. But what is the logical result of this story of teaching on the minds of the people who teach it? This doctrine of frightfulness will, already has, act as a boomerang. There is not a military man in this room who has not, from the beginning of his experience with the enemy, found that when their own methods were turned back, they were the quickest to say enough. When we turned their own infernal gas inventions against them, they appealed to the laws of war. When, after months and months of endurance of their bombardment of peaceful towns and countrysides, England, in despair and rage, retaliated, they again appealed to the laws of war. The natural reaction of their own gospel is to make them and their peoples fear the things which they taught other nations would fear. Germany has given to the world the most awful exhibits of destructiveness that mortal man has ever conceived. We who have marched through the torn and battered villages and homes of France and Belgium and Serbia have been made old and gray by the things that we have seen. She believed that this destruction would take the heart out of us. She did not know the people she attacked, and now her turn has come. My conviction is that those who have taught this frightfulness, and the people to whom they have taught it, will never have the moral or physical courage to run the risk of having applied to them what they have applied to us. The day we reach this last invincible line and make our first break in it, as we know we shall, that day the sword of the enemy will be laid down. They will not be able to face the horrors of fighting on their own land, of seeing their own villages, their own homes, undergoing the awful punishment which they have so wantonly given the villages and homes of other countries. They will yield. They will yield on the border. Gentlemen, we shall not be obliged to fight our way to Berlin. And I am one of those who will be glad when the time comes that we are not to take another life, not to devastate another mile of the earth's fair face, that we are not to batter down another cottage or destroy another beautiful work of man's hands. But that does not mean that I believe that the Allied armies should not go to Berlin. What I have at this moment to propose to this conference is that when the day comes, as it surely will, that the German and Austrian emperors and their high commands say to us, "We yield," the Allied armies shall say to them, "Gentlemen, you will yield in Berlin. We go to Berlin. But we will go to your capital not as destroyers, we go as saviors of freedom. We shall make no claim upon you in crossing your land. We shall lead our armies, French, English, Italian, American, through your fertile fields, your pleasant villages, into your beautiful capital, without cost or pain or destruction to you. We shall take with us our food. We shall ask no lodging for which we do not give fair return, and we shall pledge our honor that no woman suffer, even by word or look, from those hundreds of thousands of marching men. Gentlemen, our armies will do this if we ask it of them. To do it will give this people, who have held as a religion the destructive notion of progress and power which has encircled the earth with woe, an exhibit of what free men really are. It will show them, as no other act could do, that in our interpretation of progress and power there is no element of compulsion of others or of injury to others. If we can take these hundreds of thousands of men of ours into Berlin and leave no trace of destruction, no story of injustice behind us, we will give the world the greatest exhibit of the control that free men can exercise over themselves that it has ever seen or conceived. We shall prove the biblical saying that "He that ruleth his spirit is better than he who taketh a city." I ask then that when Germany yields, as she soon will, we say, "We receive your sword in Berlin," and that we march our armies there for that great ceremony. You will say that this is too much to ask of armies. Gentlemen, I am willing to pledge the American army to that great act of self-control. The general sat down. For a long time there was silence at the table, and then the oldest, the least smiling, the longest in arms of the English staff, arose and said, "I pledge the English Tommies to march to Berlin without injury to man or woman or child." A white-haired Italian sprang to his feet. "You may count on us," he cried. Then slowly the great French general, to whose genius the campaign soon to finish was due, arose. "Gentlemen," he said, "you all realize what it would mean to the French poilus, who have seen their country so obliterated that many of them cannot even trace the lines of the little farms on which they were born, who know that when they go back to the villages in which they and their families once lived, they will not be able to find the spot where their homes stood. You must know what it would mean to these men to march into Germany as conquerors, to see their fields still peaceful and fertile, their villages still untouched, and with this bitter contrast before their eyes, neither by look or act to show hate or insult. Yet If this conception of our American friend ever becomes possible, I pledge the French poilu to that majestic undertaking." There was but one to hear from, a king who knew that scores of his fairest towns and cities, with all their treasured work of centuries of labor and skill and love, were in hopeless, blood-stained ruins, who knew that thousands of his brave and honest countrymen and countrywomen had been dragged from the remnants of homes left them to do the bidding of the enemy in his own land, who knew that scattered in foreign lands were little children of his realm who never would know even the names to which they had been born. And the conference was still, and the hearts of all were big with pity, looking on this king who sat with bowed head. Long minutes passed before, rising proudly, he lifted to them a face which bore the look of one who comes fresh from a great struggle and a great victory. And in the quiet voice they had learned to know, the king said: "Gentlemen, I pledge you that the Belgian army will march to Berlin and leave behind it no shattered wall, no mutilated old man, no outraged woman, no orphaned child." The rhapsody was over. Dick stopped, a little breathless. Never before in all his experience as a speaker had he so lost himself. He blinked a little, then suddenly was conscious of a curious change in his audience. Disapproval, almost hostility. What was the matter? It threw him off his balance a bit, and he finished his sermon haltingly. They went out stiff, disapproving backbones. What in the world had he done? He went into the vestry room, saying to himself, "What is the matter?" It was very common for the vestrymen to come around and say, "That was fine, Ingraham. Just what ought to be said." But today the only person that waited on him at the door, as he came out, was Miss Sarah Kenton, a lady of 60 or so, whom he and Ralph were accustomed to call "our intellectual." Miss Sarah had had a literary experience. She had written books. There was no subject which ever came up on which she did not have a pronounced opinion. It must be confessed that she held most of Sabinsport in awe. With Dick she had always been as nearly humble as was possible for her, for Dick was a man who had seen most of the world which Miss Sarah had not. Besides, his reading and thinking, even she admitted, was much broader and mellower than hers. Almost invariably Miss Sarah approved of Dick. But this morning when he came out she was waiting for him very rigid and very stern, and what she said was to the point. "You've made a great mistake, Mr. Ingraham, in your sermon this morning. You have outraged us and you have injured yourself. No matter what we would do if we were given the direct alternative of sparing Germany or injuring her, an alternative which can only be hypothetical, and therefore should not be discussed now even as a mere dream. No matter, I say, what we would do if face to face with such an alternative. We don't want people to talk to us now about sparing the smiling fields and cheerful little happy homes of Germany. It isn't that we're bloodthirsty, but we're nauseated, Richard Ingraham, at talking about the blessed state of Germany compared with the desolation she has made in other countries. We don't want to hear about it." Then Miss Sarah turned on her heel and walked down the street, indignation and disgust in every tap of her shoe on the pavement. What Miss Sarah had so pointedly put straight to Dick himself, his retiring congregation was saying in more or less abbreviated and moderated forms to one another. "I can't see it," said one. "It's looking too far ahead to talk like that. Besides, it sounds like peace propaganda to me, and I won't stand for that, even from the Dominie, much as I've always believed in him." "It's pacifist talk," said another. "Makes me feel as if we'd been harboring a serpent in our bosom through all these years. It might be all very well to talk about a peaceful walk to Berlin if the Germans were not Germans, but they are Germans, the people who have stood for all these atrocities, who have been militarized out of all semblance of human beings. They must have their lesson. It's a church for a church, a cottage for a cottage, I think." "He's all wrong," said another. "Get 'em with their backs to the wall, and they would fight like hell, for they've got it into their heads that our men would do every fearful thing to their women and children that they've done to ours." The air was thick with disapproval that day in Sabinsport of the Reverend Richard Ingraham, and suspicion gathered and gathered as the day went on. Could it be that they had been mistaken, that he really was at heart a pacifist? The day was to come, and it was not far distant, when all these indignant patriots were to do their best to make amends for their resentment. Under the great burst of joyous relief which the news of the signing of the armistice caused in Sabinsport, her anger at Dick began to soften. As the days went on, and they actually saw at least the spirit of his dream coming true, their own boys crossing into the enemy's country in orderly fashion, going about the enemy's streets in self-control, even holding the enemy's children on their knees and joining in their Christmas trees and Christmas carols, a kind of wonder seized them. It was a prophecy they had listened to. Even Miss Sarah Kenton was one day to come to Dick and express her appreciation of his sermon as frankly as she had just expressed her disapproval. But all that was for a later day. There's no question at all but that at the moment Richard Ingraham had deeply outraged Sabinsport's spirit of righteous indignation against the Germans, which he had done more than any other man to awaken. He went back to his study in the rectory after his interview with Miss Sarah and sat for a long time, considering what he had done. "Good Lord," he said, "I certainly have put my foot in it. They really think I'm a pacifist." And he threw back his head and laughed aloud. But it was a rueful laugh. Disapproval was a new experience for the young man. He had had nothing but affectionate approval from the day that Sabinsport first made his acquaintance. He could not remember a time in all these years of speaking to them that his sermons had not met with kindly appreciation. And now, why, they had walked out of that church as if they thought him a German spy. And yet, underneath his chagrin, there was a certain exultation. She had a mind of her own, Sabinsport, and she's not afraid to show it. You can trust her to take care of her own, even against her own. But what a climb I will have to get back. And then quickly the thought came, I wonder if Nancy will feel as they do. That gave him a cold heart, almost a physical sickness. He could bear everything but to have Nancy look at him as the people had when he first came out of his rhapsody and realized their faces. He put it through bravely. At the evening service there was the smallest number of people that he ever remembered to have seen, but he talked exactly as he had planned. Monday had always been for him a play day. Usually he started off in the morning for a long tramp, and since he had established his friendly, homelike relations with Nancy, oftener than not he made it a point to walk into her living room at 4:30 or 5 for a cup of tea. Reuben Cowder usually made it a point, too, to get home by 5 on Mondays, knowing Dick would be there, for Reuben Cowder had grown fonder as the months went by of the young parson. And sometimes he said to himself, I wish it were Dick and not Otto that she cared for. What a son he would make. This habit of Dick's was known to Patsy. Patsy had been stirred to wrath by the echoes that had reached her before night of Sunday, and all through Monday morning, of Dick's pro-Germanism. What utter stupidity, she had said. Of course it's nothing but a reaction from the uplift they've been wallowing in. Angry as she was at the thought of any criticism of Dick, she was willing to slur even the spirit which had taken possession of the town, and in which she, as much as Dick, had rejoiced. And to Patsy, as to Dick, the only real alarm in the outbreak was that it would reach Nancy and that she might be influenced. For Patsy, you see, had come to believe that the two were in love. I think, little Ralph, she said, talking aloud to the baby, it's time for your mother to take a decisive hand. He was the best friend your father ever had. If it had not been for him, you would not have been here, little boy. If Nancy Cowder doesn't love him, she ought to. At least, she's not going to be turned against him now by this senseless gossip." And so Patsy, whose anguished heart was becoming braver and braver day by day in service to others, arrived at the McCullon farm just about the time that Nancy came in from camp. "I've come to lunch, Nancy," Patsy announced. "I want to know if you have heard what Sabinsport is doing to Dick." "Doing to Dick?" Nancy cried, turning white. "Why, what do you mean?" "She does care," Patsy said to herself. "They're doing a cruel thing. They're accusing him of treason. He who has led us all into the light, who showed Ralph the way, who gave me Ralph. They're badgering him, heckling him, Nancy, and all out of their stupid, wicked, revengeful spirit." "But what do you mean?" Nancy cried, still white and trembling. And Patsy, having made her impression, put aside her eloquence and told her what she knew of the sermon that had aroused resentment in the town. As she went on, relief, tenderness, amusement chased one another across Nancy's unconscious face. "Oh, I understand, Patsy. You needn't defend Richard Ingraham to me. He ought to have known better, though. He ought to have known the town better. Why, Sabinsport really at heart was never so bitter against Germany as she is today. It was foolish of him, but it's wicked of them to doubt him. He has led us all. Why, my father, Patsy, see what he has done for my father and for me. Why, he brought me back. Never would Father have found me if it had not been for him." It was a very satisfied Patsy that sat down at the lunch table, but it was also a very curious one. There was one point that needed clearing up, and that was Otto Littman. And so, with a calculated unconsciousness that Nancy didn't catch at all, Patsy said, "I wish I knew, just for my own guidance, what there is in all the suspicion against Otto Littman. They're saying that he's done something fine, that he has made up for all his early defense of Germany, but nobody seems to know what it is." And Nancy, quite unguarded, told her as much as she dared of what Otto himself had told her in confession, of how he had been carried away by the German dream of world empire, of how his vanity had led him in the first years of the war to aid the plotters in America, of how he had come to his senses when he saw that violence against life and property, as well as the spreading of German ideas, which he had considered legitimate, was intended, of his break with Max, of his determination to win back the confidence of Sabinsport, and of his plea that Nancy, whom he had always loved, the one woman whom he had ever thought to make his wife, should help him. "I could not do it, Patsy," she said, with tears. "But it has almost broken my heart not to stand by him as a friend in his hard uphill fight. I understand perfectly how Otto was deluded. I know his vanity, and he has done a noble thing, and the day will come when Sabinsport will understand after the war is over. But it hurts me, oh, you don't know how it hurts me, not to be able to help. But what can I do? I do not love him. I shall never love him." And Patsy, the case quite clear in her mind, went back to young Ralph, satisfied that she had done a good afternoon's work. It was a couple of hours later that Dick walked in on Nancy. Possibly, he said to himself, she had not heard of the sermon the day before, for she came running down the steps to greet him, saying, "You're late. I hoped you would come." It even seemed to him she was warmer in her greetings than usual. They were hardly in before Reuben Cowder's car drew up, and he came into the drawing room. His greeting to Dick was curt and stern. He neither delayed nor hesitated about expressing his disapproval. "What's this I hear about that sermon of yours yesterday, Ingraham? They tell me you talked some kind of twaddle about a peaceful entrance into Berlin, that you don't want the Huns punished, that you don't want any disturbance of their lands, that you propose to leave these brigands and murderers untouched. There's spoils in their hands. To let 'em get away with their infamous atrocities. If that's the way you feel, I don't want you in my house." There was a sudden little stir on one side of the room. Dick thought of it afterwards as something exactly like a bird fluttering out of its nest and flying to his side. And there was Nancy, standing straight and looking into her father's eye. Counter look for counter look. "Stop that, Father," she said. "I know what Dick said. I know exactly what he meant. No revenge could be so great as what he planned." Her hand was laid protectingly on Dick's arm. She stood, his defender. Blazing with understanding and sympathy, she had said Dick. It was the first time in all their acquaintance. And Reuben Cowder had a great light. For a hard business man it was quite extraordinary that he could divine that this was possibly the great hour in the lives of these two young people, that possibly it was not Otto after all, and with a gruff, "I beg your pardon, Ingraham," he left the room. The girl did not stir from where she stood. She did not take her hand from his arm. She only turned a very white face straight up to him. "You said Dick," he said slowly. "You meant it, Nancy?" "I meant it, Dick." Then the Reverend Richard Ingraham did the most sensible thing he ever did in his life. He put his hand over the cold one on his arm and said, "I love you, Nancy Cowder." And the reply came swiftly, unhesitatingly, "I love you, Dick." An hour later the two came out to the veranda, the look of glory still on their faces. In a few minutes, so few that he might have been accused of waiting round the corner for their appearance, Reuben Cowder joined them. Dick went straight to the point. "I've asked Nancy to marry me, Mr. Cowder. She has said yes. What do you say?" "Well," said Reuben Cowder, "I say I would rather have you for a son than any man I ever knew." The three sat long on the veranda in the warm, deepening October twilight, looking out over the great valley in its glorious autumn coloring, down to a segment of that curve of the great river above which Sabinsport lay. It was not of the past that they talked. It was not of Sabinsport's struggles and sorrows. It was not of the war news of the day. It was of the future. To all three of them, Reuben Cowder as well as Dick and Nancy, the last hour had opened the new world for which the war had been fought. "It will soon be over," Reuben said. "We've got them, sure thing. We must think now of the future, Dick. There are a lot of changes coming to Sabinsport. There will be things doing here when the boys get back. I will need you both. I'm old. I've the old ways, but I've learned something since you and Ralph Gardner came to this town, and I'm not so old that I can't learn more. I must do it, for we must reckon with those stacks there." He nodded his head to the opening he had cut long ago in the noble trees which ran down the long slope of the great lawn, an opening that he always carefully preserved, for it brought into the landscape from the veranda the tall smoke stacks of the wire mills. Dick's mind flew back to the day a dozen years before when he had walked over the hills and caught his first view of the town. There were but 4 stacks that day. There were 12 now. And from every one of the 12 black smoke rose, straight into the clear air. And they said as clear and loudly to him now as they had so long ago, "We are the strong things here. We are the things to be reckoned with." Yes, they had great struggles for great things coming, he and Reuben Cowder and Nancy Cowder, his wife. End of The Rising of the Tide by Ida Tarbell. Recording by Bob Rollins in Augusta, Georgia.